You've had the thought. Everyone who's ever loved a good IPA has had it. Learn to brew, get decent at it. Open a small tap room. Watch the regulars turn into a following. Sell a little more each year. Get on tap around town. Retire owning something people actually love. It's one of the cleanest small business dreams there is. No franchise fee, no faceless corporate parent, just you and a good product. But here's the part nobody tells you going in. The better that beer does, the less of it you actually get to keep. The exact beer that built your reputation starts bleeding you dry the moment it leaves your own building. So let's talk about what it actually takes to get in. A small production brewery, nothing fancy, just enough to be legitimate, starts around $200,000 for the brewing system alone. Tanks, kegs, a canning line, cold storage. Add the taproom build-out and you're comfortably past that. Then come the licenses, federal, state, sometimes local, each with its own fees and its own waiting period. None of that is unusual for a small manufacturing business. What's unusual is how good the numbers look once you're through it. Craft breweries report gross profit margins around 45%. Read that again. 45% before a single expansion, before a single new tap handle. A restaurant owner would kill for that. A retail shop is thrilled to clear 20% on a good day. On paper, beer looks like one of the best margin products a small business owner can make with their own two hands. And unlike a lot of manufacturing businesses, you don't need a warehouse full of specialized equipment operators or a decade of industry contacts to get started. You need a recipe people actually want to drink, and the patience to scale a batch size up from 5 gallons in your kitchen to 500 gallons in a real tank. Plenty of the most respected names in American craft beer started exactly that way. A home brewing hobby that got good enough to sell. That accessibility is part of what makes the dream so seductive. This isn't some capital-intensive industry you need connections to break into. It's a business almost anyone with a decent palate and enough savings could plausibly start. And the origin story practically writes itself. You don't need a business degree to fall in love with brewing. You need a garage, some patience, and a recipe that finally works. That's the whole appeal behind the craft beer boom that built this industry. Normal people, often with zero restaurant or manufacturing background, turning a hobby into a small empire. The country went from around 1,500 breweries in 2010 to well over 9,000 within a decade. That's not a niche trend, that's a stampede. So the dream gets built on real numbers, not fantasy ones. Good margins, low barriers to loving the work, a loyal local crowd that shows up on a Friday night and tells their friends. The tap room fills up, the reviews are good, and the next move feels obvious. Get into more bars, more restaurants, more liquor stores. Get out of your own four walls and go find the rest of your city. Every brewery owner who's ever grown past their first year has heard some version of the same advice. You've proven the beer, now you need distribution. Sounds like the natural next step, same as a bakery adding a second location or a landscaper hiring a second crew. More reach, more revenue, same great product. Nobody hands you the fine print on what happens once you sign that first distribution deal. And the fine print, it turns out, is where the actual business lives. Here's where it gets interesting. Because a brewery doesn't really sell one product at one margin. It sells the same beer through 3 completely different channels, and each one pays a wildly different amount. Start with the best one, because it's the one that gets talked about the least, the tap room. Sell a pint across your own bar, to a customer standing in your own building, and you keep almost everything. No middleman ever touched that beer between the tank and the glass. Taproom gross margin runs near 80% or higher. That's restaurant crushing, retail crushing margin for a product that costs real money to make. If a brewery could sell every drop across its own bar, this would be one of the best small businesses in America. But no brewery can sell every drop across its own bar. Only so many bar stools, only so many Friday nights, only so many people willing to drive to one specific building in one specific town, so the beer has to leave. Next stop. Draft kegs sold to bars and restaurants around town. Still a solid business, gross margin closer to 60%. You've lost a chunk compared to the taproom, because now a bar is buying your beer wholesale and marking it up themselves before it reaches a customer's hand. You're one step removed from the money. and that step costs you. Then there's the channel that actually built the modern craft beer industry. Packaged beer. Cans and bottles on a shelf at a liquor store or grocery chain, sold to people who'll never once set foot in your taproom. This is how a brewery actually scales, how a beer made in one town ends up in a fridge 3 states away. It's also the weakest margin of the three. Packaged beer typically runs around 40% gross margin, almost half of what the same beer earned poured across your own bar. Same recipe, same ingredients, same hours of brewing time. 3 completely different paychecks, depending entirely on which door the beer walks out of. And here's the twist inside the twist. The channel with the worst margin is also the one every brewery is told it needs the most. Packaged beer is what gets a brand in front of new drinkers. It's what shows up in a stranger's grocery run, what gets picked up on a whim, what turns a local following into a regional one. You can't build a following outside your own zip code by only pouring pints across your own bar. So the growth channel and the low margin channel are the exact same channel. There's no version of get bigger that doesn't also mean get thinner margins, because the only way out of the taproom is through the tier that pays the least. Put a real number on that gap because it's worth sitting with. A brewery might spend roughly $10 producing a case of beer that reaches a retail shelf at closer to $14. A $4 markup that never once touches the brewery's own bank account. That's not the brewery being greedy at the register. That $4 gets split between everyone who touched the beer after it left the building. And the brewery, the one who actually made the thing, isn't one of them. This is the part that catches new owners off guard. They build their whole financial model around the taproom numbers, that gorgeous 80% margin, then scale using packaged and draft sales, running at half that rate or worse. The business gets bigger. The margin gets thinner. Blend all 3 channels together across a typical year, and gross margin usually settles around 45%. Still healthy, still better than a lot of small businesses. But that's before rent, before payroll, before ingredients that get more expensive every year, before the loan payment on that $200,000 brewing system. Once all of that comes out, average net profit margin for a craft brewery lands around 9%, with plenty of breweries sitting somewhere between 4 and 15%, depending on how the mix shakes out. 9% on a business that looked, at the taproom stage, like one of the best margins in retail. Here's the piece that makes this genuinely strange, and not just another story about rising costs. Growth is what does this. A brewery that stayed small, 1 taproom, local following, no distribution deals, could keep operating up near that 45 to 80% range more or less indefinitely. It would never get big. It would never show up on a shelf in another state, but it would keep almost everything it earned. The moment a brewery chases growth, signs its first distribution deal to land more bars and more stores, it's voluntarily trading its best margin channel for its worst one. Every case that used to get poured across the bar at 80% now sells to a distributor at a fraction of that, so the distributor can mark it up and sell it again. The brewery isn't failing to grow. It's succeeding at growing, and getting paid less for it with every step. Owners rarely see it happen in real time, because revenue keeps climbing. More accounts, more towns, more tap handles with your logo on them. Only when you look at what actually lands in the bank, per barrel, per case, per pint, does the picture flip. Bigger top line, thinner bottom line, and a business that somehow feels more successful and more squeezed at the exact same time. So the real question isn't why so many breweries struggle to turn a profit. It's why making more beer for more people in more places pays a brewery less per pint than staying small and pouring it themselves ever did. That's not bad luck, and it's not bad beer. It's built into the structure of who gets to sell what to whom, and at what price. A structure written into law almost a century ago, long before craft beer existed at all. To understand why, you have to go back to 1933, to a law that had nothing to do with craft beer, because craft beer didn't exist yet. When Prohibition ended, states faced a real problem. Before Prohibition, breweries and distillers had a nasty habit of buying up bars outright, owning the whole chain from production to the glass, then using that control to push drinking harder than it should have been pushed. Corners got cut, Regulation was nearly impossible because the same company controlled every step. So when alcohol became legal again, states built a wall into the system on purpose. They split the business into three separate, legally distinct tiers. Producers at the top, distributors in the middle, retailers at the bottom. A brewery could sell to a distributor could sell to a retailer could sell to you. But a brewery in most states was legally barred from selling straight to a bar, a liquor store, or a customer beyond its own taproom. That's the three-tier system. Not a business practice some distributor dreamed up to squeeze breweries. Federal and state law, close to a century old, still standing almost exactly as written. Here's the part that actually explains the money. Once a brewery signs with a distributor, that distributor typically adds 25 to 30% onto the brewery's price before the beer ever reaches a retailer. Not a service fee the brewery can negotiate down once volume picks up. Baked directly into the structure of the deal. The distributor's entire business model is buying low from the brewery and selling higher to everyone downstream. Every dollar of that markup is a dollar the beer earned that never touches the brewery's account. That alone would just be a cost of doing business, the kind you plan around. What turns it into a trap is the second piece. In a lot of states, once a brewery signs, it can't easily leave. These are called franchise laws, also written decades ago, originally to protect small local distributors from getting dropped the moment a bigger brewery found a bigger partner. Made sense at the time. For a small brewery today, the effect is brutal. If a distributor loses interest, stops pushing your beer, buries it behind 300 other brands in the portfolio, lets it quietly die on a warehouse shelf, the brewery often has no legal way to walk away and find someone who'll actually sell it. In some states, ending that relationship without the distributor's agreement is nearly impossible, no matter how badly it's performing for you. So think about what that actually means for a growing brewery. You start small, keeping almost everything you earn across your own bar. You get good, demand shows up, and the natural next move, the one every business advisor will tell you to make, is signing a distribution deal so more people in more towns can drink your beer. The moment you sign it, you've permanently handed over 25 to 30% of future revenue on everything that flows through that channel. And in many states, done it in a way you can't undo if the relationship turns out badly. And it isn't just that the deal is bad going in, it's that the leverage only gets worse over time. A distributor typically carries hundreds of brands in its portfolio at once. Big national names alongside dozens of small local ones. When shelf space and tap handles are limited, and they always are, a distributor's incentive is to push whichever brand moves the most volume with the least effort, not whichever brand is the most loyal to it. A small brewery competing for attention inside that portfolio has almost no way to force the issue. It can't threaten to leave, because in a franchise law state it often legally can't. It can't easily renegotiate terms, because the distributor holds most of the cards once the contract is signed. All it can really do is hope its beer stays interesting enough, long enough, to keep getting pushed. This is why growth and margin move in opposite directions in this business. And it isn't because brewers are bad at running companies. It's because the entire distribution structure was built in 1933 to solve a totally different problem. And craft beer just happens to be the business getting squeezed by the leftover machinery. A car wash loses money to equipment that wears out faster than it pays for itself. A laundromat loses money the same way. A brewery loses money to a law that was never about beer margins at all. It was about breaking up control. And it broke up control so thoroughly that even a brewery making something people genuinely love doesn't get to decide who sells it, or how much of the money makes it back home. Let's make this concrete, because distribution margin and franchise law can sound abstract until you see what they actually did to a real brewery. Take 21st Amendment Brewery out of San Francisco. Founded in 2000, it became one of the more recognizable names in American craft beer, built a national following on approachable, patriotic-themed beers, the kind of brewery that showed up on shelves way outside its home city. It did exactly what the industry tells every ambitious brewery to do. It didn't stay small. It expanded production to a second facility in San Leandro, built out national distribution, got its beer into stores across the country for years. In 2025, ownership announced it was ceasing operations. 25 years in business, a genuinely famous name in craft beer gone. The reasons cited weren't a scandal or one bad decision. Declining volume, brutal competition for shelf space, and the cost of running both a brewpub and a full production brewery in one of the most expensive states in the country. In other words, the exact squeeze this video has been describing the whole time. A brewery that scaled up, chasing distribution and shelf space the way the whole industry told it to, and found itself paying the full cost of that decision once growth alone stopped being enough to cover it. Now widen the lens, because 21st Amendment wasn't an outlier. It was one piece of a pattern playing out across the entire country at the same time. In 2024, for the first time since 2005, more American craft breweries closed than opened. 399 closures against just 335 new openings. For almost 20 straight years, craft beer had only grown. Then, in a single year, that flipped, and it didn't correct itself. In 2025, the gap widened further. 434 breweries closed, only 268 opened. 2 consecutive years in one of the best margin small business categories in the country, where more breweries shut their doors than opened new ones. Not a story about a handful of owners making bad calls, a structural story. Look at who else went down alongside 21st Amendment. Iron Hill Brewery and Restaurant, founded in Delaware back in 1996, grew into one of the country's most recognized brewpub chains, spread across the Mid-Atlantic and beyond. Late in 2025, it abruptly closed every remaining location and filed for bankruptcy. Rising labor costs and softer restaurant traffic played a role. Sure, but so did the difficulty of running a large multi-location footprint in a craft beer market that had gotten more crowded and less forgiving with every year it grew. Here's what ties these stories together, and it's not incompetence. Both breweries did exactly what a small business is supposed to do once it succeeds. They got bigger. More locations, more distribution, more reach beyond their own 4 walls. And in an industry where every step outside the taproom door quietly hands a slice of margin to somebody else, getting bigger didn't mean getting safer. It meant multiplying the exact exposure that was already squeezing them. Zoom out even further and the pattern holds. American craft beer went from under 100 breweries in the early 80s to roughly 1,500 by 2010, to well over 9,000 by the end of the boom. A run so long and so steady that an entire generation of owners came up believing growth was simply what breweries did, year after year automatically. That assumption held for almost 2 decades. It doesn't hold anymore. The Brewers Association's own staff economist put it about as plainly as an industry insider ever does. Craft beer is no longer sailing in calm water. For 2 decades, the tide lifted almost every brewery that opened its doors. That tide has gone out, and what it's left behind isn't a story about bad beer or bad owners or a fad that finally ran its course. It's a story about a business where the version that makes the most money is the version that never leaves the building. And almost every brewery, sooner or later, feels like it has to leave the building anyway. So if the brewery isn't the one keeping the money, who is? Mostly the distributor. Not through anything shady, just through position. It takes on none of the brewing risk, none of the equipment debt, none of the $200,000 sunk into tanks before a single sale happens. It sits in the middle of a legally protected lane, adds its 25 to 30%, and moves beer that somebody else made and somebody else will keep making, whether this particular brand succeeds or not. Thanks to franchise law, in a lot of states, the distributor doesn't even have to work especially hard to keep the relationship. The brewery usually can't leave anyway. Look at the breweries actually holding steady right now, and a pattern shows up. The survivors aren't the ones chasing the most accounts or the widest shelf presence. They're the ones staying deliberately small, leaning hard into the taproom, trimming their own lineup, treating growth as optional instead of automatic. One Vermont brewery owner, scaling her business down rather than up, put it about as well as anyone could. A smaller, simpler setup can produce a better margin and a better bottom line than a bigger one ever did. That's the best case. The worst case is 21st Amendment. 25 years of real success, a genuinely loved product, scaled the way every advisor says to scale and still gone. Here's the strange part underneath all of it. The tap room was never the warm-up act before the real business began. It was the only room in the entire operation where the brewery actually kept what it earned. Everything past that door, every new bar, every new state, every new shelf, was the brewery quietly signing away its own margin, one distribution deal at a time, to a law written in 1933 that has never once cared what the beer inside the bottle actually tastes like.